There are just other prosecutors' offices I've gotten to know in Latin America. I think the corruption in Mexico has to be at one of the highest levels. In some states, the prosecutors' offices are fully subordinate to organized crime. So really, that should be, I think, we should have to what the government should be focused on. The prosecutors, maybe the state level of local police, making those stronger, much more efficient. Tell you that maybe this does have to do something with the government trying to weaken checks and balances, trying to weaken, for instance, the Supreme Court, which has been one of the main entities in Mexico that's actually pushed back on some of the proposals and proposed legislation of this government.
I can remember back to the second stuff, but in the US there's a hybrid system. Judges at the highest levels are generally appointed, but there are judges at the local, municipal, and sometimes state level that are elected. Do we have any sense of whether there's a US view of this?
Well, I think that the U.S. has been critical, but here's the big difference. In the U.S., we have no strong drug cartels that assassinate and intimidate politicians. That's what we'll have with judges in Mexico.
That's Will Freeman. He's a fellow of Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Will Freeman, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tens of thousands of Ukrainian children have lived under Russian occupation since Moscow's full-scale war in Ukraine began. Counselors at a summer camp help them work through their trauma. NPR's Hannah Marinko reports from Western Ukraine. 19-year-old camp counselor Darina Kurva is surrounded by children and teens, laughing and joking. She worked at the camp the summer before the war, where the focus was on fun. She never thought she'd be doing this job to provide psychological rehabilitation. Dasha, who is 17 and lived for months under Russian occupation in the northeastern Kharkiv region. NPR is not revealing the children's last names to protect their privacy. My house was burned, so I'm not going back there. I have no family left, except for my brother, but he is fighting in the war, Dasha says. 16-year-old Nika is from Oleshki, an occupied town in southern Ukraine. It was flooded last year when Russia blew up a giant dam on the Dnieper River. I won't be able to return home either, even when the war ends, she says. The camp's founder, Oksana Lebedeva, says the 40 children in this camp face means they are often withdrawn, full of fear and distrust. She hires counselors who can relate to the children. Darina fled her hometown at the beginning of the war. I have a fear of never returning to Kharkiv again, of never returning home. I'm afraid that I will never be able to sit on my couch in my
for business. From the Wallace Foundation, working to develop and share practices that can improve learning and enrichment for young people and the vitality of the arts for everyone. Ideas and information at wallacefoundation.org. And from listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Layla Falded.
And I'm Michelle Martin. If you ever wondered what it sounds like when an aphid eats, here you go. And here's the sound of a corn rootworm chowing down. Okay, so maybe insects' dining habits are not your jam, but a University of Wisconsin-Madison entomologist has obsessed over insect sounds for years, and she's developed a tech that she calls the insect eavesdropper. Lena Tran with WUWM reports on a tool meant to help farmers defeat costly pests.
A few years ago, this huge sugarcane farm in Indonesia, almost 100 square miles, came to Emily Bick with the challenge. Come up with a way to directly and immediately detect the moths chewing up their sugarcane. Maybe most importantly, without any harm to the crops themselves.
We lose 20% of our crop to these pests, so we should probably be doing something if we want to conserve more land for, non-agricultural use.
As she ponders her task, Bick remembers that back in the 80s,
Lansman here in Phoenix. How are you? Today's Labor Day, and the head of the nation's largest labor organization says public support for unions has now reached a 50-year high.
Polls have union favorability up in the 70% range. People under 30 are the most pro-union.
Labor unions also playing an especially visible role in the presidential race. We'll have more on that to begin the next hour of Morning Edition at about 8:08. At 7:50, though, let's check on the day's top stories around the world from the beat.
Good morning, I'm Nisha Patel at the BBC. Finland says it will stop Russians buying and renting property in its country. Finland, which joined NATO last year in response to Russia's war with Ukraine, has a tense relationship with its eastern neighbour, the BBC's Risto Pico.
Over the past decades, Russians have bought more than 3,000 properties in Finland. Many are in strategic locations. All of these are obvious targets for sabotage, something Russia has been accused of carrying out in a number of European countries.
Elsewhere, a report by the World Meteorological Organization says Africa is disproportionately impacted by climate change, despite contributing only a small fraction of global emissions. The continent has warmed faster than the global average, with North Africa seeing the most rapid increase. And Germany's leader Olaf Scholz says mainstream parties should not lend support to the AfD, or Alternative for Germany. This weekend, the AfD became the first far-right party to win the most votes in a German state election since the Second World War. The deputy leader of the AfD, Beatrix von Storch, says
conditions gathering a lot of momentum. Remember, the Fed has two jobs, getting inflation to 2%, but also keeping as many people employed as possible. Now that inflation appears to be getting under control, the Fed is turning more of its attention to the labor market. The source says even if we get a good jobs report on Friday, she still expects the Fed to cut interest rates at its September meeting because the unemployment rate has been creeping up over the past few months. Fed officials don't want to leave interest rates too high. That could slow the economy too much and snuff out job growth.
Music the way Christmas is, but maybe it should be. There is a long, rich history of workers using songs to advocate for better working conditions and to build solidarity. My Marketplace colleague, Ellen Rolfus, wrote about this for our project Econ Extra Credit. Ellen, good morning.
Hi, David.
All right, we have some of this queued already. Hit it.
From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where workers strike and organize, it's they find joy.
The legendary performer and activist Paul Robeson singing about Joe Hill. Ellen, remind me, who's Joe Hill?
Yeah, so Joe Hill was a famous, and by some people's opinion, a notorious union organizer in the early 20th century. He was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, a radical labor union, which was also known as the Singing Union, one of the first unions in the U.S. to start publishing songbooks of labor songs, which they handed out to workers all over the country as they tried to organize unions. These songbooks really helped to popularize labor protest music.
All right, we got a taste there, but give me a sense of
hostage negotiators as the administration ramps up its calls for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Massive demonstrations broke out in Tel Aviv after 6 hostages were found dead in Gaza. Speaking to reporters in front of the White House this morning, Biden said he spoke to the family of an Israeli-American who was killed.
I spoke to the American hostage. I spoke to his mom and dad. And we're not giving up.
An Israeli court has ordered workers to end a widespread strike that began early this morning. Union leaders have agreed. NPR's Carrie Kahn reports the work stoppage was called to pressure the Israeli prime minister to secure a ceasefire deal with Hamas.
Hundreds of schools and businesses had closed as part of the strike. Protesters blocked intersections, highways, and train tracks, expressing the anger and grief felt in much of the country over the killing of the hostages. Their bodies were returned to Israel over the weekend. Protesters blame Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who they say is obstructing a deal to bring home the remaining 101 hostages still held in Gaza. Official autopsy reports showed the 6 hostages were killed by gunshots. The military says within days of Israeli soldiers reaching them. Not all observed the strike. Small protests erupted Monday, supporting Netanyahu's goal of continuing the war and what he says will be the elimination of Hamas. Carrie Kahn, NPR News, Tel Aviv.
conditions, Mayor Michelle Wu is backing them.
Whenever someone comes to visit and they stay in one of these hotels, it is our hotel workers who are putting in the work and the labor to make sure they have a great experience from the very beginning.
Workers have also walked off the job in other cities, including San Francisco and Baltimore. Labor Day is kicking off the final stretch of campaigning in the 2024 presidential race. NPR's Don Gagne reports.
Labor unions are more active than ever in this election. The AFL-CIO is backing the Democratic ticket for president. For Democrats, the focus of the next 2 months will be closing the deal. Meanwhile, former President Trump is also counting on labor votes. His goal is to cut into traditional Democratic margins with such voters, which could make the difference in battleground states.
Arizona was about $2,000 as of June, according to the insurance comparison site Insurify. And as KJZZ's Greg Hawley reports, the site predicts that rates will jump to around $2,200 by the end of the year.
Data from the State Department of Insurance. This is titled Lovely One, based on her name. She is, of course, the first Black woman Supreme Court Justice, and kind of similar to the Connie Chung memoir, it'll track her come up in a field where not a lot of people look like her. And there's one more I want to shout out, actually. Al Pacino has got his book. Yeah, he's got his book coming out. It's titled Sunny Boy. The New Yorker just ran an excerpt of it, and in that section, he's talking a lot about like going to the movies with his mom and it's titled Reagan, His Life and Legend. It's a deeply reported book based on a ton of interviews and it looks at Reagan's childhood, his Hollywood years, and obviously his presidential career. Max Boot, he just published an op-ed in the Washington Post and said that like during the reporting for this book, he found that Reagan was both more ideological and more pragmatic than most people think. So, yeah, it's not like a hagiography, right? It's looking at the entire guy. And so it's definitely for people interested in the presidency like your uncle.
So Reagan was in office from 81 to 89. I take it something important happened right after?
Yes, thank you for that setup. Because in February 1989, we got the debut album from De La Soul.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, tell me, mirror, what is wrong? Can it be my daylight clothes or is it just my daylight song?
And for all the Gen Xers out there who know this, bear with me for a second while I explain to the kids that De La was this incredibly influential hip-hop group, you know, pioneering the rap we hear today. And I'm telling you this because in a few months, the music writer Marcus J. Moore is coming out with a book called High and Rising. It's a biography of the band, putting them into the context of the time and why they matter today. I know Moore's writing from a book he wrote about Kendrick Lamar a few years back, and he's really good at explaining the relationship between music and the culture at large. It's an interesting time for a De La book. I mean, one of their founding members just died last year, and for a long time, their music wasn't available on streaming services just because of like label hijinks and stuff, but it's up there now, and it's now there for a new generation.
All right, Andrew, giving us a reason to not be so bummed about summer coming to an end. Andrew Limbach hosts NPR's Book of the Day podcast. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Layla.
Hey, you are listening to Morning Edition here on the Perfect Mix of BBC, NPR, KJZZ News, and some groove on this Monday, September 2nd, 2024. Happy Labor Day morning. I'm Phil Atzman, and good to have you here. Ahead, orchards established by Mormon pioneers are still producing fruit in Utah. Experts say that heirloom fruit varieties can be insurance against climate change, even as hotter summers threaten those trees. We'll take you to neighboring Utah.